Mr. President, I rise today to discuss a matter of importance not just to Arizonans, but to people affected across the country by the Environmental Protection Agency's continuing overreach. Namely, I want to talk about air quality standards that are quite simply unattainable, and those that penalize states where Mother Nature, not smokestacks, not factories, not evil industrialists, just Mother Nature causes these effects to our air quality. Let me say from the outset, we all love and deserve to have clean air. And when I'm discussing these particular concerns, I want it to be clear, I'm not in favor of pollution, dirty air, or asthma. Instead, what I'm in favor of is just a little more common sense from the EPA. Now, it won't come as any surprise that most people in Arizona, what we realize in Arizona is we live in a desert state. We have lots of cactus. We have scorpions. I was stung just twice just last year. And just as in most deserts around the world, we have dust storms. These dust storms aren't caused by eroding topsoil or over-farming or man. They are naturally occurring events, just like tornadoes or blizzards in other parts of the country. When you live in a naturally dusty state, the dust storms sweep across the desert and across state lines. They can obviously cause local and regional air quality issues. The same goes for living in a forest fire-prone state, which Arizona also is. States simply cannot be expected to control these issues. Yet, despite adopting a, quote, exceptional events rule and issuing murky guidance, the EPA still forces states to squander resources on these spikes in air pollutants that are outside anyone's control, with no actual improvement to air quality. The EPA's reviews that to prove that spikes in air quality are the result of naturally occurring events are arbitrary, cumbersome, and they are costly. Let me give you an example. In just 2011 and 2012, the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, the Maricopa County Air Quality Department, and the Maricopa Association of Governments were forced to spend $675,000 and $675,000 and 790 staff hours to prove to EPA's satisfaction something that anyone with two eyes could readily see. Dust storms trip the EPA's air quality sensors. Not pollution, dust storms. The current regulations are entirely up to the EPA's discretion, and they are final and they are not appealable. But in some cases, such as those in Arizona, they are really a violation of common sense as well. That's why I'm introducing the CLEAR Act. The CLEAR Act will, among other things, require the EPA's decisions on those events to be based on a preponderance of evidence and to accord deference to states' own findings of when such an event happened. It will also require the EPA to review states' exceptional event documentation within 90 days instead of dragging this process out, and to decide which states with exceptional events will be evaluated. This needs to be done, Mr. President. I'm also introducing two other bills, the Ordeal Act and the Agency Pay-Go for Greenhouse Gases Act. Now, much credit goes to the EPA for successfully reducing air pollution in the past few decades. This has led to benefits for everyone. But one of the most common pollutants, ozone, the one dealt with by the Ordeal Act, has presented a nearly endless supply of red tape for states and municipalities for literally decades. When the EPA reduced its permitted ozone standards in 2008, counties across the country that were in, quote, non-attainment status were forced to enact expensive and complicated compliance plans. Now, with scant scientific health basis, the EPA wants to further lower ozone emission standards, but there are already 221 counties in 27 states that are non-compliant with the present standards. How will lowering these standards even further help these states comply, and these communities and counties comply? Is this EPA's version of double secret probation? By some estimates, this lowering of ozone standards from 75 parts per billion to 60 parts per billion will cost a whopping $1 trillion per year from 2020 to 2030. The EPA's own estimates say that the proposed standard will cost between $25 billion per year at 70 parts per billion to $90 billion per year at 60 parts per billion. It would also cost as many as 7.3 million jobs. Now, the rationale for the further reduction in ozone standards is a potential health benefits. The EPA constantly fails to meet its 5-year intervals for ozone, which results in lawsuits, bad policy, and poor analysis when the agency is forced by the courts to produce a new standard. My bill, the Ordeal Act, would provide the EPA more flexibility by doubling the statutory review interval to 10 years. It would also push off any decision on EPA's proposal to tighten the ozone standards until 2018, putting that standard on a more realistic 10-year cycle. This will give businesses more certainty. It'll give them a more certain regulatory environment, not a possible change every 5 years. You can imagine that, having to plan just on a 5-year circle for standards that are rarely met and have to be adjusted again. It will also give state air quality agencies the time they need to implement their own plans. Now, finally, this administration has set its sights on reducing carbon emissions, with the most recent attempt being draconian regulations on existing power plants, despite inevitable job losses and spikes in energy costs. The Agency Pay-Go Act that I'm introducing would simply give the EPA a taste of its own medicine by requiring the agency to offset the federal cost of any greenhouse gas rules through equivalent reduction in agency spending. If the EPA proceeds without offsetting these costs from its own budget, the final greenhouse gas rule must be approved by Congress. This bill specifically forbids the EPA from denying costs to federal agencies by passing on costs to the federal agencies' ratepayers. If capital costs are imposed by the greenhouse gas rule, the EPA must offset those costs or get Congress's approval. Specifically, this bill would not let underlying agencies, including power-generating agencies such as the Western Power Authority, it would not let them pass along these costs to consumers. Mr. President, the modern EPA has a history of implementing increasingly costly and stringent standards for negligible or even questionable benefit. All three of these bills, the CLEAR Act, the Ordeal Act, and the Agency Pay-Go Act, provide more certainty than presently exists to states and businesses that have to deal with the EPA, and it'll hold the agency accountable for its decision-making process. Now, I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting these common sense measures. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.